Matt, if this were like our grandparents sitting here, if you wanted to really get a group of Christians really at each other and feisty, what you could do is just walk in the room and be like, "Hey, what about those Bible translations?" And like the people would like throw a chair at each other. And
Bob, you were too young to remember this, but when the NIV came out, that was a huge deal. Younger people, or not necessarily younger, but some people love the NIV and would say, finally, I can understand what I'm reading. But other people really would get very uptight about letting go of the KJV. I do remember a time when I was a kid in church, somebody was reading the text for the before the sermon, and when he turned the page, you could hear dozens of pages turned, and he stopped and chuckled and said, "I guess we all have our NIV study Bibles today,"
oh,
because everybody turned at the same time.
well, it's like this interesting anxiety around it. What do you use? What translation do you use? People really, I don't get the feeling things are like that right now.
No.
The church we're at, most churches I visit, number one, most people, most is a large, most people aren't carrying print Bibles.
That's true. That's true.
And if you're using a digital Bible, you can toggle between different translations. If you use print, like one of these, I feel like they may have a preferred translation, but I wouldn't feel like they hold it close to their heart,
Mm-hmm.
as if that's the only one. But it is interesting, but Bible translation is still an enterprise. It's still going on. There's still certain values that translators use to produce these. So, what is the state of where we're at right now? I mean, I just want to talk about this. Like, what when people say, like, well, I'm going to buy a Bible, what's out there, what's available, kind of what is kind of your lean? I mean, we got the NIV,
Mm-hmm.
which is, that's like, we're coming up on like 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then you got the NRSV, which is coming up on like 30 years. And then the English Standard Version, which is owned by a lot of folks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But there's been a little bit of pushback. Maybe they lean a little conservative for some.
Mm-hmm.
What are we missing?
It seems like every time you turn around, somebody's doing a new translation of the Bible. And anytime someone does a translation of the Bible, I'm thinking of the Common English Bible, the Holman Christian Standard, which has recently been redone and rebranded as the Christian Standard Bible.
I think that was the HCSB,
Yes.
which they called Hardcore Southern Baptist. Yeah.
They dropped the name Holman, so now it's just Christian Standard. So I guess it's Core Southern Baptist.
Just the core.
I liked the HCSB, and one of the things I liked about it, I can't remember off the top of my head, but there were several places when I first got it that I would read, and it was a little bit different from what I had learned. And so I went back and I looked, and I thought, I think they've got something here. So they weren't afraid to translate a little bit against the tide. What I really liked about it was the places in the Old Testament where they where they put back the name Yahweh for the name of God. And if you read the preface of a Bible, they'll tell you what their translation philosophy is. And they said, we wanted to put the name of Yahweh where it was significant theologically, that this is talking about Yahweh. So if it's saying the name of Yahweh as opposed to the name of Chemosh or one of the other gods, Baal or whoever, that makes sense. I didn't think they took that far enough, because there were some places that looked pretty significant to me that they didn't. Well, to make up for that, in the newer version, the Christian Standard Bible, they have eliminated the name of Yahweh and have gone back to the standard practice of the Lord in all caps.
People were uncomfortable.
Yeah, well, they said that people had trouble reading it, people, especially reading aloud, or that people reported to them that they got sidetracked focusing on that word instead of catching the meaning of the text. I can appreciate that.
Well, I mean, this is market driven.
Yes.
And so you've got like the NIV and ESV kind of targeting an evangelical audience. The New Revised Standard has typically drawn a mainline Protestant audience.
And a more academic.
Academic.
For sure.
And
the Common English Bible, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that one. The Common English Bible is translated and they will openly say we wanted to have a Bible that's for everyone and not just for the evangelical market. They say that their translation value is being more open and inclusive, which if you ask the NIV or the ESV, they would not say our value is to not be open or inclusive. But you can tell when you look at some of the text, what is the motivation? Motivation, is that the right word? What's the mindset?
Okay, so let's talk about one. There's been a suggestion in the past 100 years relative to the Holocaust and things that the Bible, there are texts in the New Testament that have been used in justification of anti-Semitism and some atrocities. In John's Gospel, there's been an accusation that the writer was anti-Semitic because when he refers to the people who were chasing after Jesus and initiating his eventual crucifixion, that he simply calls these people the Jews. Now,
can I tell a story with this?
Hold on, okay. Just for everyone here, we want to make the observation. We do know that Jesus was Jewish.
Yes.
And the apostles were Jewish. So we know contextually that the Jews has a loaded meaning. What do you think? What were you going to say?
I spent 6 months working with a church in Jerusalem back in the early 90s.
I had no idea.
Yeah. And so while I was there, I was one of the very few Gentiles who was not of Arab descent. I was one of the other Gentiles. And all of my friends were Jewish. And so I had a friend that we were talking, and he was interested in spiritual matters. Most of the Jewish people I met there who were Americans were not religious, so they were Jewish by birth or by heritage, but not by faith. And my friend and I, he said, well, I'm interested in maybe reading the Bible with you. And so I said, great, that's fantastic. Well, during this time, I'm sure no one remembers this, but there was a radical Jewish person who opened fire on a lot of Arabs at the tomb of the patriarchs. And so it was an American Jewish radical killing Arabs in a sacred spot. And after that, my friend said, I can't think of anything religious right now. When I read the Gospel of John, he said, I was reading in John, and there just seemed to be a little too much glee about the Jews, getting the Jews. Yeah. And so that was 25 years ago or more. But it certainly illustrates, to me, I would read that and I get it. They're talking about the Sanhedrin or the Pharisees, the Sadducees, whoever. But to him, not being biblically literate or biblically familiar, it really came across as out to get the Jews.
Yeah, and so a translator has a decision to make. You look at this word and you're like, that means the Jews. And yet you look at it and within its context, and you know that there's kind of this like assumption behind it that this doesn't mean all Jewish people, like because Jesus was Jewish. So New Revised Standard says the Jews. John 8:52 says the Jews. New International Version says the Jews. ESV, the Jews. But then Common English Bible says the Jewish opposition. Now I don't see that word opposition in the Greek. So what do you think? I mean,
well, there are different philosophies of Bible translation, and that's not what we signed up for today. But in general, you can try to do at least one of two things in translating the Bible or anything else. You can try to say what each word means in the original language, or you can try to say what each idea is. How do you communicate the idea behind the text? And I think in that context, it's a legitimate thing to say. It's the Jewish opposition. If I were translating it, I might not have thought of that because I'm not a translator, but I think that's legit. What do you think?
Well, I do, and I think we need to like admit, and I'm part of this, like some of us were raised on the Message and Eugene Peterson, and Eugene Peterson kind of normalized an experience of reading the Bible where trying to help people fall in love with the idea of a scripture.
Bob, some of us grew up with the Living Bible,
Yeah.
which was the idea of trying to help you fall in love with reading.
Not as good as Eugene Peterson. Not as good as Eugene Peterson. I didn't even know who wrote that. It was some guy. Anyway, but there's this idea that like people really did appreciate, like, okay, this might not be the word for word, but it didn't claim to be. It wasn't misleading, and yet people did realize like that there is this robust, full message, and that if you need to know what the Greek word means, you can go to this other one, and it'll help you there. And so, in the same way, I think that like you might view a tapestry in an art museum of the stoning of Stephen, or you might watch the Jesus movie, that there's this full sensory way to access the Bible, and the message was one of those. And when you come out of that, trying to understand that these people were the Jewish opposition and not just people who happen to be Jewish is a valuable thing.
I think so. I think that does help.
Now, I want to talk about this. In church, nobody's carrying Bibles.
That is true.
So they're sitting there toggling. They're really looking at Twitter, but we think they're on their phone looking at their Bible. And this has made people not very loyal toward one translation. I'd say this is a good thing.
I think so. I was in church several years ago, and Mark Powell, a professor here, was preaching. And as he announced the text, he saw all these people pull out their phones, and he said, I know you're all getting out your phones to look at the Bible and not to send a text. So after worship, I said, no, I was sending a text.
Yeah, right.
Just so he wasn't delusioned.
I think there's a pro and a con. Pro, Bible everywhere. You get like 80 translations, which is easier than carrying 80 books. Con, pretty small number of verses on that screen. Remember that like whole we've moved past proof texting thing? We don't proof text. We read the Bible in context. Can you read the Bible in context and only have 2 verses on your screen?
That really is a challenge because it looks like that's all there is to it.
Right.
And especially if you search and you click, it'll just open up that immediate verse. And it really does give you an opportunity to read it out of context with no context.
I have a ESV study Bible here. Now this is known as the study Bible that has like way too many footnotes and study notes, okay? So I'm going to concede that. And even in the Bible that is considered to have half the page of study notes, still we're starting in verse 14 and we're ending in verse 55. I'm getting basically 40 verses within my periphery.
So there is context here, whether we pay attention to it or not.
Yeah.
I think this makes it incumbent on us as preachers and teachers of reminding people of the context, of talking about, rather than just quoting a verse, to be teachers and preachers who give a context. So even if they're looking only at this one little section, we're letting them know the surrounding context.
Yeah. I think a lot of those of you watching this are like, oh no, I have other ideas. I have verses that you need to look at so you can compare. You might have ways that you've seen people accessing the Bible that you think are interesting, or observations you have about what the market looks like for Bibles right now. And we'd love to hear that. I think it would make for some interesting conversations. So here's what we'd like you to do. Just go ahead in the comments below this video and share your experiences. Are there things in translations that you would recommend? Are there apps, Bible apps on mobile devices that you think are better than others? Any tips or recommendations to get the most out of those? I think a lot of those reading this are going to appreciate.
And I would also say, whatever Bible you love, it's okay to love that Bible. It's okay to love your translation. I grew up when there weren't a lot of choices of what translation to use. There just weren't that many out there. And sometimes when I'm speaking or preaching or teaching, I'll say something in King James. It just comes out. And if there are versions that you learn verses in, that those are sunk into your heart, that is fantastic, and appreciate that. And it's okay to take that tattered Bible that you've held on to for years and hold on to it. It's also okay to set it down and pick something up. And I find that it gives me a fresh view when I take a verse I've read for years in one translation and look at it in another translation. Several times over the last few years, one of the things I've done is go through the Bible in a year in a translation that I haven't done before. So I've gone through the Bible in the ESV. I've gone through the Bible in the Lexham English Bible. I've gone through the Bible in the Living Bible that
Never heard of it.
before. This was back in the early '80s. Sorry,
I was in diapers.
I know you were. And this year I'm going through the Bible in the new NIV, the latest NIV. Yeah. And I have to say I was not a huge fan of NIV 84. I know, blasphemy. I'm sorry. But I kind of like this NIV 2011 or 2012, whatever it is. There is a passage in 1 Corinthians 7 that I was chatting with Dr. Oster, and he said, I think the new NIV is the only one that gets that right. And after I picked myself up off the floor, I went and got a new NIV and looked at it, and that's the Bible I'm using this year is that Bible.
So you may have experiences like that too, and I found that very interesting, what Matt just said. You may have something to share also. Please do that in the comments, and we'll come back and we might address this topic another time, but we'll be back for more of these library Facebook Live videos, so continue to like the page and continue to follow us, and you can see more updates just like this. Matt, I hope you have a good weekend, and I hope the rest of you have a great day.
Thanks. God bless you. Bye-bye.